You're listening to KYRS Medical Lake in Spokane, 88.1 and 92.3 on your FM dial. Coming to you now, live from downtown Spokane. It's Long Waves with Gary Krug and today my special guests. Thank you for joining me today on Long Waves Radio. You know, one of the problems with large, complex societies is an increased distance of government from people. This lack of closeness produces an increased likelihood of misunderstanding on both the citizen side and on the side of government agencies and officials. The policies and actions governing wars and financial policies and even policing seem often far removed from the everyday lives of many people. This distance creates space that may be filled on the people's side with a sense of helplessness and powerlessness, and this can lead to mistrust and projections of fears and prejudices or even animosity. On the side of officials, a similar process may inhibit officials from recognizing the realities of people's lives, and so creating a space into which indifference or animosity or prejudice may enter. Now, we've seen the outcomes of distrust and distance and racial conflict in Pasco, in Ferguson, in L.A., and elsewhere. But to close this distance, each side must, wherever possible, make good faith attempts to move forward toward understanding and cooperation in creating a more equitable and fair relationship. In short, both must work to create trust. Without people trusting their government and without officials understanding the perceptions of their actions, animosity leading to conflict is a likely outcome. The point where law, power, and people meet is generally the criminal justice system. And for most persons, the first point of contact with the criminal justice systems are the police. For the criminal justice system to be fair and to be seen to be fair, the police and the community must have a demonstrated relationship based on law, equality under the law, and fairness in the administration of law. I'm joined today by Captain Brad Arleth, of the Spokane Police Department, and Dr. Ed Burns from the Department of Social Work at Eastern Washington University. They've released their first report of an ongoing study of officer contacts with civilians and race in the city of Spokane. It's titled Just That. Thank you for joining me, Ed and Brad. It's good to have you on the show today.
Thank you for having us, Gary.
Yeah, thank you.
Oh, no worries. Brad, I understand you are a 23-year veteran of Spokane Police Department?
That's correct. I'm currently the captain at the Downtown Police Precinct.
How many precincts do we have?
Currently there are three. One's located in Hilliard that the chief and the mayor just opened with the precinct captain up there this week and had a grand opening celebration. And there's one on the south side and then downtown.
Ah, very good. And you studied at the University of Louisville?
Yeah, I actually completed my undergraduate degree at Eastern Washington University.
Okay.
And then I finished my master's degree at University of Louisville.
And that was in criminal justice?
Yeah, administration of justice.
Administration of justice, very good. And Ed Burns, PhD in social work. You're from the University of Utah?
Yes.
Very good. You've been out at Eastern for, what, 12 years now?
Yeah, going on 13. Yeah.
Going on 13. That's a long time. Anyway, you've just released a study, which is part of an ongoing study, into racial disparity in stops by the Spokane Police. And in the study, at this point, there seems to be some disparity between the contacts of Native Americans and African Americans being disproportionately contacted. And as these contacts are necessary for searches and arrests to take place, they are disproportionately perhaps represented in those groups as well. So can we talk about the figures a little bit on what you actually found in terms of contacts by race?
Certainly. I want to start with that idea of contacts. And as a benchmark, we used a 2013 Census Bureau American Community Survey population estimates as a benchmark to compare the racial proportions from that.
Okay,
From
so
data from that benchmark to the population that has contact with the police. In order for a contact to be recorded, it needed to be officer initiated and be in person, not a telephone contact. And it had to involve either someone being briefly detained or that there was some chance, some risk of them being detained. And so we had a 5-month period from March through August of last year, 2014. And we had 7,021 contacts recorded.
Mm-hmm.
So of those, so now I'm going to get to numbers. I just wanted to give you some background
Sure.
about our data set. So African Americans are 2.5% of the city of Spokane population.
Okay.
They were 6.1% of contacts between civilians and officers that met our criteria.
Okay.
Native Americans were 1.7% of the city population and were 3% of the contacts. So those are the two racial groups that we saw that were overrepresented. And when I did a probability analysis, that was indeed beyond the level of chance alone.
Okay, so you had a sample group of 7,021 contacts
Right.
that were reported. This was by police officers in the streets.
Right.
And I noticed that there was a range of contact types, motor vehicle being the largest, pedestrian being about 13%, and bicycle 9%. That kind of surprised me a little bit.
Right.
But bicycles and motor vehicles. And of motor vehicles, there were some interesting numbers there as well. In that, why would police stop motor vehicles?
Well, the primary reason that motor vehicles are stopped is going to be for a traffic infraction, so a violation of the municipal code for traffic.
Okay, so and what? Well, let's go on with the study here a little bit more. If we're so the study's ongoing, you have all of these samples from police officers in the field.
Right.
So tell me about the kind of data that you collected in the study.
Okay, so, and I'm glad you're going to be posting the report on the station's website. And
Oh, on the show's website, on the
show's
Facebook
website.
page, yes, indeed.
Oh, great, on the Facebook page. Perfect. Because, folks could be stopped for hazardous moving violations. That was about 60% of our stops, 58%. But the officers, when they had one of these contacts, would then they have an electronic computer and then an electronic database they can access,
Okay.
and they enter the data. And it's just a quick questionnaire that identifies the officer,
Uh-huh.
identifies the reason for the stop and the race of the person stopped, and how the officer determined the race of the person stopped, and then the outcomes. And that's what I want to get to also. So, we have this disproportionate contact.
Mm-hmm.
And when you take a look at the data on searches and arrests, that disproportionality of African Americans and Native Americans continues.
Mhm.
Okay? Where African Americans are about 6% of the contacts, they're a little bit, they're over 10% of the searches. And likewise, Native Americans, 3% of the contacts, they're about 8% of the searches.
Mm-hmm.
But we had the good fortune to drill down a little bit. So one of the questions was, why are people being searched? And there were two reasons that people were being searched. One is an officer safety frisk,
Right.
which is just a pat-down that the officer can use.
Which the police are allowed under state law to search for concealed weapons that might be on the person. This is standing. There's
Right.
no reason actually needed for this.
Right. It's
Well,
Well, Brad,
Yeah,
you
let
wanna-
me clarify that just a little
Please.
bit. There, by our policy that we wrote to go with this data collection effort, one of the reasons for a collection document to be completed would be if we performed what's called a Terry stop. So for those who want to look at case law, it's Terry v. Ohio. And in that case and subsequent case law, the police are within legal rights if they determine that a crime has been committed, is being committed, or is about to be committed, to temporarily stop and detain a person for as long as necessary to resolve that ambiguous situation. The part B of that Terry stop for a pat search is if the officer reasonably believes that the person is armed or could be in possession of some sort of dangerous weapon that they could use on them. So there does have to be a legal justification for it, and when we go to that extent, then we are completing one of these forms.
Okay, so there has to be some reason that officers would detain a person for one of these forms to be filed, or is this just contact? Can you separate this? Can you clarify this distinction?
Yes. When we set this up, and this, not to rabbit trail too far here, but
it's a necessary detail.
Yeah, Ed and I took a look at several different, I guess several is minimizing it. We took a look at an extensive list of other studies, best practices. We looked at the RAND report from NYPD's Stop and Frisk. We looked at documents and publications from DOJ cops. We looked at things from other cities. We looked at previous reports on racial data collection. We also used a lot of information from Northeastern University's Center for Racial Bias and Policing and Racial Profiling to develop this form that we utilized, that we got made into an electronic form so that we could capture all the data. So the policy is written to support that, and it's very clear. So police officers will complete an officer interaction form on all officer-initiated interactions. And so then we detailed that. So in a consensual encounter, not necessary. Pedestrian stop, bike stop, motor vehicle stop, Terry stop, necessary. So there's some very clear guidelines that supports the effort that we're making here, and gives some clear guidelines to officers as to when a data interaction form needs to be completed.
Okay.
Yeah, and a big part of that for me as a researcher was to get right to the narrative about what goes on when officers insert themselves into somebody's life. So I want to come back to the data about searches.
Okay.
Well, no, go ahead. It looked like you had a question. Go ahead.
I just wanted to go through the initial breakdown of your 7,021 contacts. You had 78% were motor vehicle contacts, and 68%, so a smaller percentage of that 78%, were hazardous moving violations. The other were 22% were other motor vehicle. And then you had investigatory contacts at 16%. What is an investigatory contact?
So the investigatory contact is going to be more along the lines of a Terry stop or a suspicious person stop. So think, typically somebody's walking down an alley at night, a couple of people are walking down an alley, dogs start barking, somebody sees them, police officer sees them in an area that they've been directed to put an emphasis on because of vehicle prowlings or garage burglaries. The officer checks out with them to find out, what are you doing here? Where do you live? What's going on? So that's an investigatory stop. That is one area that we included on this specifically because many agencies and cities that have had issues with disproportionality of huge percentages, their problems have been surrounding investigatory stops because it's discretionary in the eyes of the officer as to who they stop, and that's one of the things that we wanted to look at. In our case, I think one of the good things about this report and what we found, and I think what Ed's going to highlight too, is our percentage in Spokane of just raw investigatory stops is much less than other cities that have studied this same issue.
Okay. Well, that's good to know. But I do understand the people who are walking by looking in every car's window and rattling doorknobs and this kind of bit. Service calls 2%, and assist civilian 1%, and then DUI 0.3, just to get through the major block of numbers. Now, Ed, you wanted to say something about
Well, I want to
these
let you
numbers,
know
did you?
also that this is the first 5 months of data. We'll be releasing another report sometime in the fall, probably late September, beginning of October, where I should be able to have enough data. You see, here's what the thing is: Spokane's a fairly racially homogeneous place, and in fact, all the other places we looked at where this kind of research has been done are much more diverse. So that we're in kind of a unique spot. But what you can anticipate in our next report is that we're going to drill down into these reasons for stops by race because we'll
Sure.
finally have enough data to make a good probability estimate. It's one of those things, a coin toss can come up heads or tails. If I
Yeah.
toss it 9 times, I might get 9 heads or 9 tails. If I toss it 200 times, I'm probably going to get closer to 100 and 100. So just making a decent probability estimate is going to take more data. Now I want to come to this idea of the searches, okay? And So we found some disproportionality in searches, and I described those numbers to you a moment ago, and that indeed was beyond chance alone. But when we got to the reasons for these searches, there were really two reasons. One was safety risks, and that was about 4% of the searches overall.
Uh-huh.
And 96% of the searches were post-arrest. And when somebody's arrested, they have to be searched, okay? You could imagine what would happen if folks were arrested, taken to jail, they had not been searched, all the kind of risk and mayhem. And mayhem not just to officers, but to other civilians that are in jail and things. So that has to happen. And the thing that we found in the data is that there really was no disproportionality about the reasons
For searches.
for searches. That it was not beyond chance alone. And as you'll see, in the report, I put the figures up there. There was not much variability in why folks were searched. Across races, there wasn't a racial imbalance there.
Well, that makes a sort of sense. There's a number here I don't understand. You're showing that there were 570 arrests
Right.
and 570 searches and 632 arrests.
Yes. And there's one thing that I discovered is, so I have, when officers make arrests, I think some of them assumed that I knew that they were going to be making searches. But being a social scientist, I'm not in the business of filling in gaps. Does that make sense?
Right.
So we're going to have numbers that are a bit tighter that way in the next round. But I just think that was what it was. An assumption, of course, if we made an arrest, they got to know we made a search. And so they didn't always click that.
That makes sense. So roughly then we're talking about 9% of the contacts resulted in an arrest.
Yeah, and about 8% were searches.
Okay. And use of force, the number was surprisingly low, 22?
Right, but I want to really highlight something that's critical here in terms of the reasons for searches and the reasons for arrests. Because it was an unusual finding. You see, if the narrative that officers are busy kind of cooking up reasons to search people, well, then those safety frisks, those Terry frisks, you would see that disproportionality there. And so the evidence doesn't support that narrative that officers are busy searching people disproportionately on purpose, okay, that these are happening from arrests. And why are arrests happening? It's almost a 50-50 split between warrants and new charges. Again, while we found that racial disproportionality in arrests, and it was almost the same proportions as you would see for searches, and that would make sense because the two go hand in hand. Mm-hmm. But we didn't find that racial disproportionality in the reasons for arrest. So if there was a narrative that officers are busy trying to arrest people, well, first off, it was only like 9% of the contacts resulted in arrests, so that wouldn't seem like they're busy trying to arrest people. But if they were trying to arrest people of particular groups, you'd see a disproportionality in the new charges compared to the warrants, and that was not showing up on our data. And I hope that's a pattern that holds true throughout time. And I would imagine anybody in our community would want to see that continue to be the way it is.
Okay. That makes a great deal of sense. So officers' perception of race, this is self-reported by the officers on the form?
That's correct. One of the things that in doing our research ahead of time to look at what was the best practice, what academic material and practitioner research material had been written about this topic, that's a very important key when you're looking at any kind of racial data collection effort, is to find out what is the officer's perception of the person's race, because that's really the question that all of this hinges on, is are the police taking a discretionary action for some type of reason or some type of motivation, and is it based on race? Mm-hmm. And so that's one of the things. The other thing that Ed will explain as a researcher, which he brought to my attention, meshed with that, and that is the idea of not taking a situation in which an officer's contacting somebody who in all likelihood, I mean, let's face it, probably doesn't really want to be contacted for a bicycle stop or a traffic infraction or a pedestrian infraction or for loitering somewhere where they shouldn't be. It's pretty rare that people are like, oh, hello, officer, thanks for, pulling me over today. And so we didn't want to add that element of inflammation by asking that question, which a lot of people can be very sensitive to as to the nature of their ethnicity. And again, the real key question hinges on what is the officer's perception.
Right.
Right.
But you did mention that could actually inflame the situation and escalate it if the officer were to ask the question of race. Then it was, why do you want to know what race I am? Is this going to, impact the way you treat me as a person in the contact?
Exactly. And I think, given the nature of the relations between police and minority communities in the history of this country, I think that's a legitimate concern that people would bring into the contact, is why are you asking me that question?
Yeah.
Right. So substantively, the research question really turned on officers' perception, and the narrative that we're trying to bring some information to bear on turns on officer perception. And then there's the ethical reason, which, both professional associations that I ascribe to the ethics of, and not only ascribe, but I really believe in the ethics of, say, do not do any harm. And when I look at the risk-benefit of this, the risk of escalating a situation that could harm a civilian or an officer, for that matter, but could bring some harm to somebody, to get at, validating to a kind of a validity study of officers' perceptions, it just doesn't match that. And I had to stick with the primary directive of do no harm.
That makes a lot of sense. I want to kind of go through the numbers one by one, because I think they do need a little explaining.
Sure.
So if we go through the contacts by race, searches, arrests, which of those were for warrants and which of those were new charges? So Native Americans are 1.7% of the Spokane population. They are 3% of contacts, so that's a little less than twice the number of the population. 8.4% of searches and 7.6% of arrests. Now, how are we to read these numbers? How am I to understand this escalation after contact to searches and arrests?
One thing you have to keep in mind to understand it is that the benchmarks change a little bit. For contact, everybody in the city of Spokane has a chance of being contacted by the police. So we use the population of the city of Spokane as our benchmark, is where we derive our population percentages from.
And when we get through the discussion of the numbers, I want to raise this with you and Brad in a little bit of our kind of free discussion at the end of this. But yeah, go ahead, Dad.
So when we get to the idea of searches or arrests, just as events themselves, without looking at the reasons, just the search happened or an arrest happened, the benchmark for comparison has to be the proportions of those who are in contact with officers, because a search isn't going to occur unless a contact has preceded it, nor is an arrest going to occur if a contact hasn't preceded it. So a lot of other studies, and the Justice Department has written extensively about this, and kind of in a woeful situation, that we can't use the general population of the city as a benchmark, because not everybody in the city has been contacted by officers. We have to use those who have been contacted. Then when we start looking at the reasons for searches, the reasons for arrests, we have to look at the population of people who have been arrested or have been searched, because the reasons do not apply to people who have not experienced that event.
Well, that's true enough.
So that's the logic of our benchmarking.
And again, if we just continue with the Native American population, so 8.4% of searches, 7.6% of arrests, and again, ballparky warrants and new charges about 50%, 54.2 and 45.8. So there is likely to encounter new charges as they are to have an existing warrant, and does both factor into this? There's a warrant and there are new charges, or is this just one or the other?
I'm going to examine. That's a question that was raised in a meeting yesterday, so I am going to examine that co-occurrence. It's not present in this report, but it certainly will be in the next one.
Okay. Thank you for that. Let's move down to Hispanic, who are 5.3% of the population and 3.3% of contacts. So that's actually a bit lower. Is that statistically significant, that drop?
Not at just. I'd have to get a little bit into an arcane conversation.
Let's
with
not
you,
go too arcane on
but,
the
I would just
listeners. I
tell
don't
you
want them
this
to
much.
fall asleep on me.
The magnitude of that underrepresentation is not as large as
Okay.
the magnitude of the observed overrepresentations.
Okay.
Doesn't mean that it's not there. It's just not of larger magnitude.
And then the numbers on the Hispanic population on searches and arrests are also low,
Mm-hmm.
and the breakdown on warrants versus new charges also stays low.
Right.
So African Americans, 2.5% of the population. I didn't realize how white bread this town really was. 2.5% of the population, 6.1% of contacts, 10.4% of searches, 10.9% of arrests, and again the even breakdown on warrants versus new charges. So there is a disparity on that population and on Native Americans that we'll talk about in the discussion toward the end of the show. About what that means and what we'll have to do. Asian Pacific Islanders population 3.2%. That surprised me. It was that high actually. And contacts 2.9%, so they're down a little. 1.1% of searches, and these must be such small numbers that
Right.
it's hard to do anything statistically with them. Warrant versus new charge, yeah, that's got to be so small. It's minuscule.
Right. In fact, there are only 9 people who are Asian Pacific Islander race who were arrested at all.
Who were contacted.
So,
Yeah, all right, we'll just slide right past that one then.
yeah, well, I want to change to the term we're using there. We're not going to slide past it, but revisit it when we have
Revisit
more data for a robust analysis.
Better said. I meant didn't mean to imply anything other than the numbers were too small to say anything statistical about them.
Great. Thank you very much for clarifying.
And thank you for the interjection. So, white population, 87.1% of the community. Contacts, 84.6%. So they are 76.3% of searches, 76.4% of arrests, and again, the breakdown on warrants versus new charges are about the same. Mm-hmm. So overwhelmingly, it's white people who are contacted, arrested, searched, not necessarily in that order, which is not surprising given the population. But the disparity, how significant is this disparity on African Americans and on Native Americans? How do we put this into a context? If this were white people, could we say how many white folks were being arrested? I'm trying to get some sort of proportional sense.
What appears to be driving the findings of significance are the magnitudes of difference for Native Americans and African Americans. Okay? And you and I can hang around after the show, and I'll show you some very lengthy tables with things like standardized views. There's all this other argument.
Oh, let's not.
Okay. But I'm a statistician to the point of being boring to most people. So, but that's where the market difference occurs. But the thing that the data keep pointing me toward is this. That when we look at the reasons for arrests, the reasons for searches, we're not finding the disproportionality there. The data keeps pointing me back to having a discussion in our community, a rather honest, uncomfortable, and necessarily holistic discussion in our community about that point of contact. What's driving contacts in the first place? Mm-hmm. And even though I'm going to have more data, and I'd be glad to come back on the show in October and go over the updated data, I also understand that the data are overlaid on a constructed kind of reality and on a narrative, and so we have to have conversations. I could crunch numbers the rest of my life, and it won't inform this nearly as much as members of the community, particularly the African American and Native American communities that are affected by this, getting together with the police and having some conversations, holistic ones. And I'll tell you what I mean by holistic in a minute.
Yeah, we'll get into that. And Brad, I wanted to ask you about the use of force. Out of 7,021 stops, there were 22 reportable uses of force, which is 0.3%, which seems to me like a remarkably small number given the reputation some forces have for use of force. And you mentioned the urban realities that sometimes require use of force. Can you speak to that just a little bit, please?
Yeah, I can. And when when Ed and I took a look at the data, we actually weren't that shocked by the low number, because at the same time, not from our research, the department was working on use of force numbers with the Community-Oriented Policing Services Office of the Department of Justice under our Technical Assistance Project. And for the preceding years prior to this data, we found out that our use of force percentage was extremely, extremely low. And in some parts of this country, it exceeds 1%, 1.4%. And so when we're looking at numbers of 0.3%, what we found from these current numbers is pretty consistent with what was determined by the Department of Justice and published in their findings. I think that is a result of several things, and the continued drop that we saw with the data we're looking at is a result of Chief Stroud bringing in crisis intervention training. With a renewed effort, we are going to have an enhanced crisis intervention team training process, which is going to give select officers even more intensive training. As a supervisor, we see it being used in the field. Mm-hmm. We had de-escalation training early in 2014. I think that has an effect on that number. This week we have 20 people in some enhanced de-escalation training here locally in conjunction with Washington State University. So internally, we're doing a lot of things to concentrate on dropping the necessity for use of force. Sometimes it's going to happen. I mean, when you throw people who are in a terrible situation, their life is in crisis, they're under the influence of alcohol or some sort of chemical, they're having a mental health crisis, at certain times things are going to happen and force is going to be a reality. Of course, our goal is to minimize that as much as possible, and I think that we're making a lot of strides in that direction.
Let me just mention to our listeners here that you're listening to Long Waves Radio, and I'm joined today by Captain Brad Arleth and Dr. Ed Burns. Captain Arleth from the Spokane Police Department and Dr. Burns from Eastern Washington University, and we're discussing the report on race and contacts in Spokane. So we're talking about the importance of these programs, de-escalating. So it's not a question of going to force. And I've done some studying on violence myself, and I know that de-escalation is something that's sometimes very hard for men to do. There's almost like a circuit in the brain that men want to engage. They'll get wound up in what some folks call the monkey dance. Yeah. It becomes a dominance display for men. So if
it goes along with not asking for directions.
I expect it does. But you've worked with mental health professionals in this crisis intervention training, I understand, from WSU and from other sites around, and the verbal de-escalation, and there's good evidence, I think, that these are effective in the literature, and you're finding that as well in your situations. And this is mandated for all officers, or?
Yes, the crisis intervention training basic 40-hour course is mandatory for all of our police officers at every rank. New hires get it, of course. And then the de-escalation training that we went through was part of our core hours of our in-service training for 2014. And so we have ongoing training on those topics scheduled. That'll be part of the content of our internal training throughout 2015, and I'm sure going into 2016 as well.
Well, that sounds like very good stuff to have going on in our community. Now, we mentioned that the study is only of the Spokane Police Department. Is anyone collecting data on the Sheriff's Office, State Patrol, similar kinds of material, to your knowledge?
I have not been in contact with anybody from those two agencies regarding their doing that research, but I'm not all-knowing. So these kind of things may be occurring without my knowing, and I would certainly respond positively to outreach from any law enforcement agency that wanted to begin to develop procedures to do this kind of work.
Yeah.
But I can't work for everybody. There's only one of me. I still teach classes and things, but I'd certainly be willing to guide and advise.
Yeah. One of the things that we decided was important as a reason for doing this, besides having some interaction with the community and finding out what the numbers are, is the fact that there is a state RCW that mandates that police departments, law enforcement agencies, are to collect data. Theirs primarily revolves around traffic stops. Mm-hmm. We've been a little bit more ambitious at expanding that to pedestrian stops and bicycle stops, which is taking another big. It really increased the task exponentially. Mm-hmm. And so I'm not sure what other agencies are doing. They're in the police side of things with some of the research groups. There is a lot of publications that talk about some of the challenges. And I think, as Ed mentioned earlier, one of the challenges locally is when you have a community that's less diverse. Mm-hmm. Clearly, you can have some issues with the numbers and people saying, well, look what you're doing, or look what you're doing. And so I think across the nation, particularly over the last 10 years since some of these issues started being raised, and they first came about through some driving while black issues, some racially biased stop issues, and so on, there was some reticence on the part of some police executives to even jump into this pool, because once you jump in and see some of the numbers, then you're compelled to have an honest conversation. And that's, the one thing that I think we're fortunate here in Spokane to have a police chief who, when we discussed the need to do this and the importance of it, agreed and embraced it and gave us the latitude to explore this, and is willing to sit at the table and have these discussions.
Well, having grown up on the buckle of the Bible Belt back in the bad old days, and having, in a much less racially diverse, much more racially diverse community than Spokane, I know that can be a huge factor in some settings. So it's nice to see that the Spokane Police Department are actually on top of trying to create a police force that is colorblind, that is trying to equally provide justice for citizens here. And I think your data is largely supporting that, and the steps you've taken have gone a long way toward reducing the incidences of violence, reducing the incidence of having to cart people off, and maybe let's just calm down, to violence intervention and the verbal de-escalation. Ed, did you want to say something here?
Well, I just wanted to what you were talking about with the good fortune of our department being a more open system. I want to make it really clear that there was a timeline to this. It's not like Brad and I just suddenly decided to do this. Brad reached out to me back in the summer of 2012, back when the Use of Force Commission was taking testimony. It was in response to some of my testimony. Right. And we started having conversations and reading things and discussing with each other what we read. And, this was building, we were going this direction for a while. The department was beginning to open up a while ago. And, we're seeing the result of it now, but I want to make it really clear that this was a process.
Oh, yeah.
And that we began developing our instrument back in the summer of 2013. And we were pretty deliberate and did a lot of reading. They always say you should not trust somebody that writes more than they read. Well, we took that to heart. But so I just want to point out that, that this difference we're seeing is part of a developmental process that's going to keep moving forward.
There are a lot of facets to it as well. Police departments, there's a lot of academic research to support police departments that have close working relationships with their local universities and researchers are more early adopters of new trends, new technology, new information. They're more socially open. And so that's a facet that we are working to further. Clearly, some of the use of force recommendations and the Department of Justice recommendations, the President's Task Force on 21st Century Policing, some of those common themes that you can draw from some of those are police legitimacy, transparency, procedural justice, and I think that being able to go through a process like this, produce data, draw some conclusions, have some discussions, is all part of that. Those are all facets of working towards achieving those. In fact, part of our in-service presentation for Spokane Police Department coming up starting on the 25th of this month, there's a 2-hour block, and I think that right now, as far as I understand the schedule for this year and next year, there will be blocks of instruction for all officers regardless of rank, regardless of tenure, on procedural justice and police legitimacy.
So how exactly do you define procedural justice?
Well, both ideas of procedural justice and police legitimacy they embrace the idea that what the police are doing is right and that it's fair, and that because of that, people respect the authority of the local government and the authority that they basically have ceded to other people to keep the peace, essentially. And so, one of the ways that I've explained it to people as I've kind of introduced the topic is if a neighborhood suddenly sees an influx of police cars and they're stopping everybody, they may not understand what's going on, so they think that that's unfair. However, if we've had a lot of complaints about speeding motorists, kids almost being run over, and we take the time to start explaining to people, somebody still might be unhappy about getting a ticket for speeding through a park zone, but at least they're going to understand the reason behind it. And so when you start looking at everything that we do, from civil enforcement on seizures to closing a bar for violence, to arresting drug dealers, to traffic enforcement, to arresting people for domestic violence, some explanation of the why we're doing that as we try to carry out that law enforcement, peacekeeper, guardian role of the police. And I mean, that's a whole other topic of how the role of the police have changed. And, the current trend, I think, in the United States is for agencies who are on the cutting edge is to make a real full-fledged return to outreach and community policing and knowing who it is that we're serving and remembering that. And so I think that's all kind of encompassed in that.
Okay. I think that's important that people have that sense that it is fair, it is being administered equally, it's an even-handed administration of legitimate law that people, by and large, respect most of the time.
And that there's a reason for it.
And there's a reason for it. I would like to return to the mention that you made in the paper that all Spokane residents have an equal likelihood of an officer contact. And I would like to discuss this briefly, this assumption, because I know there are factors that influence whether I get stopped or not. If I'm driving my 92 Nissan pickup with a strange bumper sticker, I get stopped more often than when I drive my late model car. So I'm wondering about factors like this, factors of neighborhood that I know you're not controlling for in your studies so far, but looking down the road.
I want to get. I'm glad you asked about down the road. First off, I would tell you that when I wrote that all people have an equal probability of being stopped, that is the idea of what's a statistical universe. That's a group of folks that all have an equal chance. That's the baseline assumption. Then we look and see, hey, what actually happens compared to what probability theory would dictate about a universe. Okay, so that was just a statistical probability statement, all right? The other thing is that I spent a bunch of time this summer looking at Census Tract Census Tract data from the Census Bureau, and comparing that to the patrol areas, the patrol blocks that the police designate, and found where they overlay. And so I've got a very good idea of the racial makeup of these different patrol blocks.
Right.
What's unfortunate, and I didn't come up with this idea all by myself. Okay, I came up with this from the Rand Corporation examining the NYPD stop and frisk data, and the Department of Justice also advocates it. But what inspired me was that Rand report. So we have that data, but the thing that to remember is, like, this is, you called it a white bread community. I'm going to sound a little bit academic and call it a more racially homogeneous community. So when I start overlaying neighborhoods and arrests and stops and the small proportion of people of color in the town, I don't get a robust analysis yet. I'm going to be doing some of those neighborhood level analyses
And
in the
by
September report.
Bust analysis mean you don't have enough numbers to say
Right,
a lot
well,
statistically.
Right, like if I cross
it.
over neighborhood, race, and arrest, and I look at how many open boxes there are in that table, there's a lot of empty boxes right now, and so I need more cases to fill it in. And some neighborhoods are more heavily patrolled than others, and thus have more contacts going on.
And Brad,
than
you
other
could
ones.
speak to that perhaps?
Yeah, I can, and part of that is our the way that we deploy our resources. So, in addition to having the precincts, because of the size of our staffing and the availability of patrol units, and the fact that we're an agency that works 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. What we do from the precincts, utilizing technology, utilizing our crime analysis, utilizing some of the principles of CompStat and place-based policing, focused area policing, we will look at concentrations of crimes that have occurred, use some of the software through crime analysis to form some prediction models as to where the days of the week, the time, etc., as to where we could have more of those continued crimes if we don't put some effort there, and then we will make assignments of the patrol resources to spend some time there. We are currently looking at how we will implement looking at that and what effect that has, because clearly if I say, okay, around the arena there may be a certain series of incidents that coincide with events, or in this particular area we've experienced a lot of vehicle prowls, let's say somewhere northeast Spokane, or some daytime burglaries. I'm going to assign a certain number of officers there, and they're going to make visits to that area looking for suspicious vehicles, activity, people around the clock. Clearly we're going to stop more people in that area because of that, because we're directing the resources there. Again, sometimes it's neighborhood generated. Someone will call and say, hey, I run a shop up here, and every night when I leave at 6 o'clock, I'm kind of in a little bit of an industrial area. I see some gathering going on, or some kind of sketchy activity. I'd like to have somebody work out here, and we may find that there's a problem. So those factors all come together, and the result is, people are being stopped in certain areas, sometimes more than they're being stopped in other areas. And so we're trying to find a way to balance some of that out and know, why are we doing this here? Why are we doing that there?
Well, that makes a great deal of sense. I mean, I like to say ours is the last good house before the neighborhood becomes interesting. And I sometimes call it Fort Apache. But, and I appreciate that there's a lot more patrolling on one side of my house down that way than there is up the other way. And I get the reasons for it, because I live in the neighborhood, and I see the foot traffic, and I see the vehicle traffic, and I hear the fights, and occasionally I hear the gunfights, and, gunshots and all of that. So, I appreciate you do want to focus where the crimes are, where there's most risk to civilians, where there's most risk to property, and that's where you're going to put your resources. That just makes good sense. You don't send the fire truck to a house that isn't burning.
Correct.
Well, I was just kind of looking. I want to make sure that I drive home a point that the data led me to. Okay. So here's what I'm hoping that we do. The data very clearly point me as a researcher in the direction that we have to have conversations that talk about those what are the reasons for stops. There are statistical analyses that I'm able to do. I'll be able to do more of them with more data. This is going to keep moving forward, so that is where it's going to go in the future. We're also going to ask some new additional questions. I don't know what all those are, because I want to hear from the community. I don't want to just make them up myself. Okay. So.
That would be good, and that goes on to the point that Brad mentioned, and you called for in your report, that you want ongoing and deliberate conversations about disproportionate minority contacts with officers.
And holistic conversations. You see, the holistic conversations need to involve police practices. That has to be part of the conversation. But we have to look at citywide and neighborhood level conditions like poverty, employment, unemployment, housing, homelessness. what the schools are like, what are the opportunities for positive youth development, what kind of substance use and mental health problems are we seeing that are patterns in some areas, maybe not in others, but whatever happens in a larger context. And so my experience has been that the Spokane Police Department is open to talking about police practices, and obviously they're open to examining them. Not that we wouldn't have this report if they weren't. But we've got to pull together and talk about the whole.
And that's pulling together as an entire community, not just the police department. This is that to address the issues you were just speaking of. We need more than a police response. We need a community response. We need health care, schools, training, jobs, neighborhood, community building activities.
One of the biggest things that will continue to reduce crime in this community or any other is the building of community efficacy. And when people feel connected, and when people feel involved, and when people feel like it's worth it, then they will take care of their community. And the police can partner with them in that area, and they will partner in a lot stronger ways with the schools. They'll partner with the health district, and that's kind of the web, that's kind of the fabric of life that builds cities, is that community efficacy. Certainly the police are a valuable asset to the community in that way, because we have certain things that we can do to stop crime, prevent problems, help the community in ways that they can, and we can also bring in other resources from local government. But that community building is key, and that's one of the important parts of us having the precincts and doing some of the other things that we're doing with youth outreach right now, is to further those goals.
And part of that has to do with transparency, so I really appreciate you giving us the opportunity to be transparent about the findings of this study, and that it's going to be ongoing.
Well, I'm glad to have you both on the show. Thank you so
Thanks,
much
Gary.
for coming. Captain Brad Arleth.
That's it.
I'll get it in a minute. And Dr. Ed Burns from Eastern Washington University. You've been listening to Long Waves Radio here on KYRS. Thank you so much for listening. You can email me at longwaves@kyrs.org. Find me on Facebook, find me on Facebook, Long Waves Radio. You can also find links to the podcasts of this show and other shows. And you are listening to KYRS Medical Lake, Spokane, 88.1, 92.3 on your FM dial.